Steve Miller thought he was doing his brother Ben a favor by arranging this blind date. He never imagined he'd come face to face with the only woman who ever shattered his heart, and discover she'd been raising his child in secret for 8 years. It was supposed to be simple. Ben had been complaining for weeks about his disastrous dating life, and Steve's assistant Marge had mentioned her friend Dr. Juno Anderson knew someone perfect for him. A successful, beautiful woman who'd recently moved back to the city. Someone sophisticated enough to handle the Miller family dynamics, yet down-to-earth enough to see past Ben's sometimes overwhelming enthusiasm. Steve had agreed to meet them at Meridian, the upscale restaurant where he often conducted business dinners. He'd play the protective older brother, make sure this mystery woman wasn't after Ben's trust fund, and then excuse himself for a quiet evening at home with quarterly reports. It was a Tuesday night routine that suited his carefully controlled world perfectly. The restaurant hummed with its usual elegant energy, crystal glasses chiming softly, the gentle murmur of sophisticated conversation, the subtle fragrance of truffle oil and fresh orchids. Steve sat at his preferred corner table, checking his Rolex for the 3rd time. Ben was characteristically late, but that gave Steve time to review the woman's basic information. Camille Williams, art gallery owner, 32 years old, no children listed. Clean background, impressive credentials, seemed genuine enough from what little Juno had shared. He lifted his coffee cup, scanning the entrance with the same methodical attention he brought to board meetings. The bronze revolving door caught the light as it spun, admitting a couple celebrating an anniversary, then a businessman he recognized from the financial district. Steve's fingers drummed against the white tablecloth as he mentally rehearsed his standard Big Brother interrogation. Then the world stopped. The revolving door turned once more, and she stepped into the restaurant like a vision from his most tormented dreams. Camille Williams moved with the same liquid grace he remembered, her natural curls now worn in an elegant updo that showcased the graceful curve of her neck. She wore a flowing emerald dress that brought out the warm depths of her brown eyes, eyes that had haunted him for 9 years. Steve's coffee cup began to tremble in his hands. This couldn't be happening. The Camille Williams his brother was supposed to meet couldn't possibly be his Camille Williams. The woman who'd vanished from his life without explanation, leaving only a brief note about needing space and a ring on his nightstand. But those eyes, those impossible, beautiful eyes that used to look at him like he hung the moon, they found his across the crowded restaurant, and time collapsed into nothing. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and join our Dear Love Diaries family. Your special place in this community of heartfelt stories is waiting for you. These passionate journeys of souls connecting against all odds have brought together thousands of beautiful hearts just like yours. Make sure you hit the bell too, so you'll know immediately when a new story unfolds in our diary of love. Camille's face went completely pale. Her lips parted in shock, and for a moment, she swayed on her elegant heels as if the ground had shifted beneath her. The hostess was saying something to her, gesturing toward the Miller table, but Camille seemed frozen in place. Steve forced himself to stand, his legs unsteady in a way that would have embarrassed him in any other circumstances. 9 years of wondering, of sleepless nights and unanswered questions, and here she was. More beautiful than ever, more poised, more unreachable. The successful gallery owner who'd built a life without him. Camille? His voice came out rougher than intended, carrying across the space between them like a prayer. She closed her eyes for just a moment, as if gathering strength, then opened them with the same fierce determination he remembered. When she moved toward their table, every other sound in the restaurant seemed to fade into background noise. "Hello, Steve." Her voice was carefully controlled, professional even, but he caught the slight tremor underneath. "I didn't realize you'd be here." "I'm Ben's." He stopped, realization hitting him like a physical blow. "You're here for Ben. You're his date." The hostess looked between them with growing confusion. "Mr. Miller? Should I still seat Ms. Williams at your table, or?" "Yes," Steve managed, pulling out Camille's chair with muscle memory that had survived nearly a decade. Please. Camille hesitated for just a moment before accepting the seat, her fingers brushing his as she adjusted her purse. The contact sent electricity shooting up his arm, and from the way her breath caught, he knew she felt it too. "Where is Ben?" she asked quietly, not quite meeting his eyes. "Running late, as usual." Steve sat back down, grateful for the table between them. He needed the barrier, something to keep him from reaching across and touching her face to make sure she was real. He should be here any moment. They sat in silence for several heartbeats, the weight of 9 years pressing down on them. Steve studied her face, noting the subtle changes. There were faint laugh lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before, and a maturity in her expression that spoke of hard-won wisdom. She was even more stunning than the 23-year-old woman who'd stolen his heart, but there was something guarded in her posture now, a wariness that cut him deep. "You look good," he said finally, immediately regretting how inadequate the words sounded. Camille's laugh was soft and slightly bitter. "Thank you. You look successful." Her gaze swept over his perfectly tailored suit, the expensive watch, the confidence that came from years of commanding boardrooms. "Miller Industries has done well for itself. We've expanded considerably." The business talk felt safer, more familiar territory. "Acquired 3 smaller tech companies in the last 5 years, went international. Dad finally stepped back and let me run things the way I always said I would." Something flickered in her expression at the mention of his father, but before he could analyze it, Ben burst through the restaurant entrance like a whirlwind of enthusiasm and nervous energy. Sorry. Ben called out, weaving between tables with his characteristic lack of grace. "Traffic was insane, and then I couldn't find parking, and..." He stopped dead when he reached their table, looking between Steve and Camille with growing bewilderment. "Wait. Do you two know each other?" Steve opened his mouth, but no words came. "How did you explain to your little brother that the woman he was supposed to charm over dinner was the love of your life who'd disappeared without a trace? How did you admit that you'd spent 9 years trying to forget someone, only to discover they'd been living in the same city, building a life you knew nothing about?" "We used to know each other," Camille said carefully, extending her hand to Ben with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "A long time ago. You must be Ben. Juno's told me wonderful things about you." Ben shook her hand, but his confused gaze kept bouncing between them. "Used to know each other? Like, friends or?" "We dated," Steve said bluntly, unable to handle the careful diplomacy any longer. 9 years ago. Dated? Ben's voice went up an octave. "You dated the woman Juno set me up with? How did you not know her name when I told you about tonight?" "Juno mentioned your first name," Steve said to Camille, his heart hammering against his ribs. "But I never connected. I didn't know you'd taken back your maiden name." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Camille's fingers tightened around her water glass, and Steve saw her fighting to maintain her composure. "I never changed it," she said quietly. "We never got that far." The simple statement felt like a knife between his ribs. They'd been engaged, ring chosen and wedding planned, but she'd left before they could make it official. Before they could build the life he'd dreamed of every night since. Ben looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. "Okay, this is officially the most awkward blind date setup in the history of blind date setups. Should I just go? Leave you two to catch up? Have you ever come face to face with someone from your past who completely changed your life? Share your experience in the comments below." Camille started to stand. "Actually, that might be best. This was clearly a mistake, don't." Steve's hand shot out, almost covering hers on the table before he caught himself. "Please." Ben went to a lot of trouble to arrange this. "The least we can do is have dinner like civilized adults." Camille studied his face for a long moment, and he found himself holding his breath. Finally, she settled back into her chair with a small nod. "You're right. I'm sorry, Ben. This isn't your fault. She managed a more genuine smile for his brother. Why don't you tell me about this new startup Juno mentioned? The app development company? Ben's face brightened immediately, and Steve felt a stab of something uncomfortably close to jealousy as his brother launched into an enthusiastic description of his latest project. Camille listened with what appeared to be genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions and laughing at Ben's self-deprecating jokes about his coding disasters. Steve found himself studying her profile as she talked, noting the way she tilted her head when she was really listening, the gentle way she encouraged Ben's rambling stories. She'd always been good with people, had a gift for making others feel heard and valued. It was one of the things that had made him fall so completely, so recklessly in love with her. What about you? Ben asked, turning his full attention to Camille. Juno said you own an art gallery? That must be incredible. It is. For the first time since entering the restaurant, Camille's smile became radiant. I opened Expressions Gallery about 3 years ago. We focus on emerging artists, particularly those whose voices have been underrepresented in traditional gallery spaces. It's challenging, but incredibly rewarding. That's amazing, Ben said with genuine admiration. Steve's always been hopeless with art. Remember that sculpture you bought for the lobby, Steve? The one that looks like a twisted piece of metal, Steve finished dryly. Yes, I remember your very vocal critique. Camille's eyes sparkled with what might have been amusement. Contemporary abstract expressionism isn't for everyone. You always were the artistic one, Steve said before he could stop himself. The words created an intimate bubble around them, temporarily excluding Ben from the conversation. I remember you dragging me to that little gallery downtown, trying to explain why a canvas covered in blue paint was supposed to move me. Rothko, Camille said softly. And I didn't drag you. You asked to come. I wanted to understand what you saw in it. The admission slipped out, raw and honest. I wanted to understand everything that made you light up that way. The air between them grew thick with memory and unspoken longing. Ben cleared his throat uncomfortably. Okay, I'm definitely feeling like a third wheel here, he said with forced lightness. Should I order another round of drinks, or are you two going to keep having this intense eye contact thing that's making me feel like I'm invisible? Camille blinked and looked away first, a flush creeping up her neck. I'm sorry. We should probably, actually, Ben said, standing abruptly and pulling his wallet from his jacket. I think I should go. This clearly isn't the evening any of us planned, and you two obviously have things to discuss. He dropped enough cash on the table to cover dinner for all three of them. Camille, it was lovely meeting you, even under these bizarre circumstances. Steve, I'll talk to you tomorrow. Ben, wait, Steve started to stand, but his brother was already weaving his way toward the exit with determined speed. Suddenly, they were alone. The restaurant continued its elegant hum around them, but their corner table felt isolated from the rest of the world. Steve could hear his own heartbeat in the silence that stretched between them. Well, Camille said finally, her voice carefully neutral. That went about as well as could be expected. Camille, Steve stopped, realizing he had no idea what to say. 9 years of imagined conversations, and now that she was sitting across from him, every word felt inadequate. She was studying her hands, her wedding ring finger notably bare. How have you been, Steve? Really? The simple question opened something inside his chest that he'd kept carefully locked away. Successful, he said, echoing her earlier observation. Wealthy. Accomplished. Everything my father always said I should be. He paused, meeting her eyes directly. Empty. Camille's breath caught almost imperceptibly. Steve. What about you? He leaned forward slightly, drawn by some magnetic force he'd never been able to resist. Are you happy? Have you found what you were looking for when you left? For a moment, her careful composure cracked, and he saw a flash of the woman he'd loved so desperately. Vulnerable, fierce, achingly beautiful in her honesty. "I found purpose," she said carefully. "I found strength I didn't know I had. I built something meaningful with my life." "But are you happy?" he pressed gently. Camille was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I learned to be content. Sometimes that has to be enough." The words hit him like a physical blow. Content. Not happy, not fulfilled, not joyful. Content. As if she'd trained herself to accept less than she deserved, the way he'd trained himself to accept the hollow satisfaction of professional achievement without personal connection. "Camille, about what happened between us, don't." She held up her hand, and he saw it was trembling slightly. "Please. I can't, not here, not like this." Steve looked around the restaurant, suddenly aware of the other diners, the waitstaff hovering nearby, the public nature of their reunion. She was right. This conversation was too important, too loaded with history and pain, to have surrounded by strangers. "Have dinner with me," he said impulsively. "Tomorrow night. Somewhere private where we can actually talk." Camille shook her head immediately. "That's not a good idea." "Why not? We're both adults. We can have a civilized conversation about what happened." "Because some conversations are better left unfinished," she said, but her eyes betrayed her. He could see the same longing there that had been eating at him for 9 years. "Is there someone else?" The question came out more roughly than he intended. "Are you seeing someone?" "That's not." "It's complicated." "That's not an answer." Camille sighed, and suddenly she looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the late hour. "No, Steve. There's no one else. There hasn't been anyone serious since," she stopped herself, but the implication hung between them. "Since him." Since whatever had driven her away had also made her unable to fully open her heart to anyone else. The knowledge should have made him feel triumphant, but instead it just made him sad for both of them. "Then have dinner with me," he said again, softer this time. "One evening. Let me try to understand what went wrong." Camille stared at him for a long moment, and he found himself holding his breath. Finally, she reached into her purse and pulled out a business card, writing something on the back. "My gallery," she said, sliding the card across the table. "Tomorrow at 7. After hours, so we won't be interrupted." Steve took the card, his fingers brushing hers again. This time, neither of them pulled away immediately. The contact was electric, familiar, and terrifying in its intensity. "Thank you," he said quietly. Camille stood, gathering her purse with hands that weren't quite steady. "This doesn't mean anything, Steve. I'm not making any promises about where this conversation leads." "I understand." She nodded once, then turned toward the exit. Steve watched her walk away, noting the proud set of her shoulders, the way she moved through the restaurant like she owned every space she entered. At the door, she paused and looked back at him, and for just a moment, her carefully maintained composure slipped entirely. The look she gave him was full of 9 years of unanswered questions, unspoken grief, and something else, something that made his heart race with possibilities he'd thought were lost forever. Then she was gone, leaving only the faint scent of her perfume and the business card clutched in his trembling hand. Chapter 2. Steve spent the next 24 hours in a state of controlled chaos. He cancelled 2 meetings, rescheduled a conference call with Tokyo, and found himself staring out his office window at the city skyline, remembering the way Camille's eyes had looked in the restaurant lighting. Marge noticed his distraction immediately. "You've been checking your watch every 5 minutes for the past hour," she observed, setting his afternoon coffee on the mahogany desk. "Hot date tonight?" Steve's laugh was bitter. "Something like that." Marge had been his assistant for 8 years. She'd seen him through hostile takeovers, family drama, and more failed first dates than either of them cared to count. But she'd never seen him like this, wound tight as a spring, alternating between anticipation and something that looked dangerously close to panic. "Want to talk about it?" she offered, settling into the chair across from his desk with the familiarity of someone who'd earned the right to speak freely. "Remember when I told you about someone from my past? The reason I don't do serious relationships?" Marge's expression shifted to one of careful attention. "The one who got away." "She didn't get away. She was driven away." Steve's hands clenched into fists on the desk. "And last night, I discovered she's been living in this city for 3 years. Building a life I knew nothing about." "Oh, honey." Marge's voice was soft with understanding. "What are you going to do?" "I'm having dinner with her tonight. At her gallery." He met Marge's concerned gaze. "I need to know why she left, Marge. I need to understand what I did wrong. And what if the answer isn't something you can fix?" Steve was quiet for a long moment, considering the question that had been haunting him since he'd left the restaurant. "Then at least I'll know. And maybe I can finally move on." But even as he said the words, he knew they weren't true. He'd been trying to move on for 9 years, and seeing Camille again had proven that some connections were too deep to ever truly sever. By 6:30, Steve was standing outside Expression's gallery, studying the elegant storefront with its floor-to-ceiling windows and carefully curated displays. Even from the street, he could see that Camille had created something beautiful here. The gallery space was warm and inviting, with rich hardwood floors and soft lighting that made the artwork glow like jewels. Through the window, he could see her moving around inside, adjusting a painting here, straightening a sculpture there. She'd changed into dark jeans and a cream-colored sweater that highlighted her natural beauty. Her hair was down now, falling in soft curls around her shoulders the way he remembered from lazy Sunday mornings when the world outside their apartment hadn't existed. Steve took a deep breath and pushed open the gallery door. A small bell chimed softly, and Camille looked up from the painting she'd been adjusting. For a moment, they simply stared at each other across the space that represented her life's work. "You came," she said quietly. "Did you think I wouldn't?" "I wasn't sure." Camille gestured around the gallery with obvious pride tinged with nervousness. "Welcome to my world." Steve stepped deeper into the space, immediately struck by the passion and intelligence of the curation. Every piece was thoughtfully placed, creating a flow that told stories about resilience, beauty, and the complex experiences of being human. This wasn't just a gallery, it was Camille's heart laid bare for the world to see. "It's incredible," he said, and meant it. "You've created something really special here. Thank you." Her smile was genuine now, the professional mask slipping away as she watched him appreciate her life's work. "This piece here," she moved to a large canvas dominated by warm golds and deep purples. "It's by a young woman who grew up in foster care. She paints her memories of temporary bedrooms, but somehow makes them feel like home." Steve studied the painting, seeing what Camille saw, not just technique, but story. Soul. "You always had an eye for finding the extraordinary in the overlooked. Is that what I did with you?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, and immediately she looked embarrassed. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean." "Yes," Steve said simply. "You saw something in me that I'd forgotten existed. Something my father spent years trying to eliminate." The mention of David Miller created a visible shift in Camille's posture. Her shoulders tensed, and she moved away from him under the pretense of adjusting another display. "How is your father?" she asked carefully. "The same. Demanding, controlling, absolutely convinced he knows what's best for everyone in the Miller family." Steve watched her face closely. "He asks about you sometimes." Camille's hand stilled on the sculpture she'd been repositioning. "He does?" He wonders if I ever hear from you. If I know what happened to David Miller's future daughter-in-law who disappeared so suddenly. Steve took a step closer. What does he not know, Camille? What really happened the night you left? For a moment, he thought she might finally tell him the truth. Her face went through a dozen emotions: pain, anger, something that looked like grief. But then she straightened her shoulders and moved to another section of the gallery. That's ancient history, Steve. We should focus on the present. The present where you're raising a child alone while I've spent 9 years wondering what I did wrong? Camille froze. Slowly, she turned to face him, her face completely pale. What did you say? Steve felt his heart stop. Ben mentioned, when he was telling me about you, he said Juno mentioned you had an 8-year-old daughter. The silence that followed was deafening. Camille's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall, and Steve felt the world tilt on its axis as the timeline clicked into place with devastating clarity. 8 years old, he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. Camille, please tell me I'm wrong. Please tell me that what I'm thinking isn't possible. But the look on her face told him everything he needed to know. The daughter she'd been raising alone, the child he'd never known existed, the 8-year-old who would have been conceived just before Camille disappeared from his life. Her name is Cheryl, Camille said quietly, each word seeming to cost her everything. And she has your eyes. Steve's legs gave out. He sank into the nearest chair, his head in his hands as the magnitude of what he'd lost crashed over him. Not just Camille. Not just their love. But a child. His daughter. 8 years of bedtime stories and scraped knees and school plays and birthday parties that he'd missed because he'd never even known they existed. Why? The word came out broken, raw with pain. Why didn't you tell me? Camille was crying now, tears streaming down her face as years of carefully maintained composure finally cracked. Because I couldn't. Because he made it impossible. Because I had to choose between you and our baby, and I chose her. He? Camille, who made it impossible? What aren't you telling me? But before she could answer, the gallery door chimed again. Both of them looked up to see a young girl with caramel skin and Steve's unmistakable green eyes peering through the glass. She had a school backpack slung over one shoulder and a bright smile that faltered when she saw her mother's tears. Mama? The little girl, Cheryl, pushed open the door and rushed to Camille's side. What's wrong? Why are you crying? Camille quickly wiped her eyes, wrapping her arms around her daughter in a protective embrace. I'm okay, baby. Just talking about some grown-up things. Cheryl's intelligent gaze moved to Steve, studying him with the frank curiosity of a child. Are you the reason Mama's sad? The question hit Steve like a physical blow. This beautiful, perfect little girl, his daughter, saw him as a threat to her mother's well-being. Which, he supposed, was exactly what he was. I hope not, he managed, his voice thick with emotion. I would never want to make your mama sad. She cries sometimes, Cheryl said matter-of-factly, still studying Steve with those eyes that were so achingly familiar. When she thinks I'm asleep. She looks at this painting she won't let anyone buy, and she cries. Steve's gaze shot to Camille, who had gone pale again. What painting? Cheryl, sweetheart, why don't you go start your homework in the back office? Camille's voice was carefully controlled. I'll be there in a few minutes. But I want to know who this man is, Cheryl protested with the stubbornness that Steve somehow knew she'd inherited from both her parents. He feels important. He is important, Camille said quietly, meeting Steve's eyes over their daughter's head. But some conversations need to happen between adults first. Cheryl looked between them with obvious reluctance, but finally nodded and headed toward the back of the gallery. At the doorway, she turned back. Will you still be here when I finish my homework? She asked Steve. If your mother says it's okay. Cheryl looked at Camille expectantly. After a long moment, Camille nodded. Good, Cheryl said with satisfaction. I want to show you my drawings. Mama says I'm really good at faces. When they were alone again, Steve and Camille stared at each other across the gallery space that suddenly felt charged with 8 years of secrets and pain. She's beautiful, Steve said finally. She's perfect, and she's mine, and I've missed everything. Steve, no. He stood up, pacing to the window as he tried to process the emotional overload. I've missed 8 years of my daughter's life. 8 years, Camille. Her first steps, her first words, her first day of school. I don't even know what her favorite color is, or if she's afraid of the dark, or what makes her laugh. Purple, Camille said softly. Her favorite color is purple. She used to be afraid of thunderstorms but not anymore. And she laughs at terrible dad jokes, which she probably gets from you. The simple details broke something open in Steve's chest. He turned back to face Camille, and she could see the raw pain in his expression. Why? He asked again. Why would you keep this from me? I know I wasn't perfect, but I would have been there. I would have loved her, protected her, given her everything. That's exactly why I couldn't tell you, Camille said, her voice gaining strength. Because you would have given her everything, and in doing so, you would have destroyed yourself trying to please a man who was never going to accept us. What does my father have to do with this? Camille closed her eyes, and when she opened them, Steve saw a depth of pain that made his chest ache. Everything, she whispered. He has everything to do with this. Sometimes the people we love most are the ones who hurt us deepest. Have you ever had to choose between protecting your heart and taking a chance on love again? Let us know in the comments. Before Steve could demand an explanation, Cheryl's voice called out from the back office. Mama. I need help with this math problem. Camille looked at Steve with something that might have been desperation. She doesn't know. About you, I mean. She knows she has a father, but I've never. I told her he was someone I loved very much who had to go away before she was born. Go away, Steve repeated hollowly. Is that what you think happened? That I chose to leave? Didn't you? The question was barely audible, but it cut deeper than a scream. Steve stared at her, realization dawning with horrible clarity. You don't know. You have no idea that I spent 2 years looking for you. Hiring investigators, calling every mutual friend, checking hospitals. I thought you were dead, Camille. I thought I'd lost you forever. The color drained from Camille's face. You looked for me? I tore apart half the state trying to find you. The only reason I stopped was because your friend Jessica finally told me you were safe but didn't want to be found. That you'd made it clear you never wanted to see me again. Jessica never. Camille stopped, her hand flying to her throat. Oh God. She was protecting me. I asked her to make sure you couldn't find us if you ever tried. Us, Steve repeated, the word hitting him like a sledgehammer. You were pregnant when you asked her to hide you from me. Camille nodded, tears streaming down her face again. I was 3 months along. Scared, alone, and convinced that choosing you meant choosing a life that would destroy everything beautiful about what we had. Mama. Cheryl called again, more insistently. Coming, baby. Camille wiped her eyes and looked at Steve with something that might have been hope mixed with terror. Will you stay? Let me get her settled with her homework, and then we can talk properly. I owe you that much. I owe you everything. Steve nodded, not trusting his voice. As Camille hurried toward the back office, he found himself alone with her art, surrounded by the visual representation of a life built without him. A life that included his daughter. He moved through the gallery slowly, seeing it with new eyes now. There were subtle hints everywhere of a mother's love, child-safe corners on display cases, a small chair tucked discreetly in one corner where Cheryl could sit and draw while her mother worked, artwork hung at heights that would allow a growing child to appreciate them. And then he saw it. The painting Cheryl had mentioned, the one her mother wouldn't sell. It was tucked away in a small alcove, almost hidden from casual view. Steve approached it with the reverence he might have given a religious artifact. The painting was a study in blues and grays, with touches of gold that caught the light like hope trying to break through storm clouds. But it wasn't the technique or the color palette that made Steve's breath catch in his throat. It was the subject matter. A man's silhouette, turned away from the viewer, hands pressed against a window as if he were trying to reach through the glass to something precious on the other side. The pose was achingly familiar. It was the way Steve used to stand at his apartment window in the mornings, looking out at the city and dreaming of the future he and Camille would build together. In the bottom corner, barely visible unless you knew to look for it, was a small inscription: "What could have been? For the love I had to leave behind." Steve sank into the chair across from the painting, overwhelmed by the realization that Camille had been carrying the same grief, the same longing that had haunted him for 9 years. She hadn't left because she stopped loving him. She'd left because she loved him too much to watch their love be destroyed by forces beyond their control. I painted that the year after Cheryl was born, Camille's voice came from behind him, soft and full of old pain. I was working through some things in therapy, and my doctor suggested I try to express what I couldn't say out loud. Steve turned to find her standing in the doorway, having settled Cheryl with her homework. "You've been in therapy?" Single motherhood is hard under the best circumstances. When you're grieving the love of your life at the same time, it's nearly impossible without help. Camille moved to stand beside his chair, both of them looking at the painting. "I had some very dark days those first few years." "I'm sorry," Steve said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. "I'm so sorry you went through that alone. You didn't know. But I should have found you anyway. I should have tried harder, looked longer. If I'd known about Cheryl, if you'd known about Cheryl, you would have done exactly what your father feared you'd do," Camille interrupted gently. "You would have chosen us over Miller Industries. Over his approval. Over the life he'd planned for you since birth." Steve looked up at her, seeing the truth written in her expression. "That's what this is about." "My father." Camille nodded, settling into the chair beside him. "The night I left, he came to see me. While you were at that emergency board meeting he'd called." Steve's blood went cold. "What did he say to you?" "He told me about the ultimatum he'd given you. The choice between me and your inheritance, your position in the company, your family name." Camille's voice was steady now, but Steve could hear the old pain underneath. "He said you'd been struggling with the decision for weeks, that you were too honorable to break up with me directly, but that you'd thank him later for making the hard choice." "That's a lie." Steve's voice was harsh with fury. "He never gave me any ultimatum. I would have chosen you, Camille. Without hesitation, without regret. I would have chosen you and our life together over everything else." "I know that now," she said softly. "But at 23, pregnant and terrified, facing a man who had more power and resources than I could even comprehend? I believed him when he said loving you would destroy you." Steve stood up abruptly, pacing away from the painting as rage coursed through him. "He manipulated you. He lied to both of us to keep us apart. He told me that if I really loved you, I'd leave before you had to make a choice that would ruin your life. He said he could make sure I was taken care of, that I'd never want for anything, but that I had to disappear completely. Never contact you, never tell you about the baby." "The baby he knew about?" Steve's voice was dangerously quiet. "I was showing by then. Not much, but enough that he noticed." Camille's hands moved protectively to her stomach, a gesture that was probably unconscious but broke Steve's heart. "He said no grandchild of his would be raised outside of marriage, but that marriage to me would destroy everything he'd built. So he offered me a choice, leave and be supported, or stay and watch everything you cared about crumble. Steve felt sick. 9 years of grief and self-doubt, of wondering what he'd done wrong, of believing that the woman he loved had simply decided he wasn't worth fighting for. And all of it had been orchestrated by his own father. "Where did you go?" he asked quietly. "California." He arranged for an apartment, enough money to get by until after Cheryl was born. "After that, I was on my own." Camille's smile was bitter. "I'd already given notice at my job, told my friends I was moving for a new opportunity. It was surprisingly easy to disappear when someone with David Miller's resources is helping you do it." "And you never thought to call me? To tell me the truth?" "Every day for the first 2 years," she admitted. "But by then, Jessica told me you'd moved on. That you were dating other people, throwing yourself into work, building the life your father had always wanted for you. I convinced myself that maybe he'd been right. Maybe loving me would have destroyed you." Steve closed his eyes, remembering those dark years after she'd left. The women he'd dated in desperate attempts to feel something, anything. The way he'd buried himself in work because it was the only thing that stopped him from thinking about what he'd lost. "I wasn't building anything," he said quietly. "I was surviving. Barely." "Steve, Mama?" Cheryl's voice interrupted them from the doorway. "I finished my homework. Can I show the man my drawings now?" Steve turned to look at his daughter, and felt his heart break and heal simultaneously. She was looking at him with open curiosity, holding a sketchbook against her chest. "If that's okay with your mama," he said, glancing at Camille for permission. Camille nodded, though her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Come here, baby. Show us what you've been working on." Cheryl skipped over with the natural exuberance of a child, climbing onto the arm of Camille's chair and opening her sketchbook. The pages were filled with drawings that showed genuine talent, portraits of her mother, her friend Dr. Juno, various people from around the neighborhood. "This is my favorite," she said, showing them a drawing of a man's profile. The features were skillfully rendered for a child's work, and Steve felt his breath catch as he recognized the strong jaw, the particular way the hair fell across the forehead. "Who is that?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "My daddy," Cheryl said matter-of-factly. "Mama showed me a picture once, and I've been practicing drawing him. She says he was very handsome and very kind, and that he would have loved me very much if he could have stayed." Steve looked at Camille over their daughter's head, seeing his own pain reflected in her eyes. "She's an amazing artist," he managed. "She gets that from both sides," Camille said softly. "You always saw things differently than other people. You just expressed it through business instead of art." Cheryl studied Steve's face with the intense concentration of a child trying to solve a puzzle. "You have the same eyes as my daddy," she announced. "The same color green." Steve's heart stopped. "Do I?" "Uh-huh. And the same nose too." She tilted her head, comparing his face to her drawing. "Are you sure you're not related to him?" The question hung in the air like a loaded gun. Steve looked at Camille, seeing his own panic reflected in her expression. This wasn't how either of them had imagined this moment would happen. "Cheryl, sweetheart," Camille said carefully, "what would you think if I told you that sometimes people we think are gone forever aren't really gone? That sometimes they come back when we least expect it?" Cheryl's eyes widened with the quick intelligence that was so clearly inherited from both her parents. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" Steve found himself holding his breath as his 8-year-old daughter processed the situation with remarkable insight. "You're him, aren't you?" she said quietly, looking directly at Steve. "You're my daddy." The words hung between them, 8 years of separation and pain and love crystallized into one moment of recognition. Steve felt tears he'd been holding back finally spill over as he nodded. "Yes," he whispered. "I'm your daddy. And I have loved you every day since the moment I learned you existed, which was about an hour ago. Cheryl stared at him for a long moment, processing this life-changing revelation with the resilience that children possess. Then, to Steve's amazement, she smiled. I knew it, she said with satisfaction. I told Mama you felt important. And then, as naturally as breathing, she climbed off Camille's chair and into Steve's arms, hugging him with the fierce love of a child who'd been waiting her whole life for this moment. Steve held his daughter for the first time, breathing in the scent of her hair and feeling her small arms around his neck, and knew that whatever came next, this moment was worth 9 years of pain. This was worth everything. Chapter 3. The next few days passed in a blur of tentative family moments that felt both surreal and perfectly natural. Steve found himself rearranging his entire schedule around Cheryl's bedtime stories and soccer practice, discovering that nothing Miller Industries demanded could compete with his daughter's laughter. He was reading to Cheryl from her favorite book about a dragon who learned to paint when his phone buzzed with an urgent text from Marge, "Your father's back from Europe early. He's asking questions about your cancelled meetings. Wants to see you first thing Monday." Steve's blood ran cold. David Miller wasn't supposed to return from his business trip for another week. The timing felt too coincidental, especially given how small their social circles really were in a city like this. Daddy? Cheryl's voice pulled him back to the present. She'd started calling him that so naturally, as if she'd been waiting 8 years to finally have the word fit someone real. You look worried. Is everything okay? Steve set his phone aside and smiled at his daughter, marveling again at how quickly she'd accepted him into her life. Everything's fine, sweetheart. Just some work stuff. Mama always looks like that when she's worried about the gallery, Cheryl observed with the unsettling perceptiveness of a child. Are you worried about the same things grown-ups are always worried about? Money and mean people and boring meetings? Steve couldn't help but laugh. Sometimes. But right now, I'm much more interested in finding out whether our dragon friend is going to finish his masterpiece. They continued reading, but Steve's mind kept drifting to the implications of his father's early return. David Miller had an uncanny ability to appear whenever Steve's life was moving in directions he didn't approve of. And Steve had no doubt that his father's network of contacts would have already informed him about the Miller heirs' sudden interest in a certain art gallery owner and her daughter. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that usually energized Steve for the week ahead. Today, however, he felt like he was walking into battle. He'd spent the weekend in a bubble of domestic happiness with Camille and Cheryl, and now reality was crashing back in the form of his father's inevitable disapproval. David Miller was waiting in Steve's office when he arrived, seated behind Steve's own desk as if he owned the place. Which, technically, he still did through various complicated trust arrangements that kept the family money firmly under patriarchal control. Son, David said without looking up from the quarterly reports he was reviewing. We need to talk. Steve set his briefcase down carefully, using the moment to gather his composure. Good morning, Dad. How was Europe? Profitable. Though I hear my absence allowed you to develop some concerning new interests. David finally looked up, his steel-gray eyes sharp with disapproval. Care to explain why you've been seen around town with Camille Williams and her daughter? So his father knew. Of course he knew. David Miller's information network was legendary, a web of contacts and favors that ensured very little happened in their social circle without his knowledge. Her name is Cheryl, Steve said carefully. And she's my daughter too. The word seemed to echo in the suddenly silent office. David's face went through a series of expressions, surprise, calculation, and finally, cold fury. I see she's playing that card now, David said with disgust. I suppose 8 years of support payments weren't enough. Now she wants to drag you into some ridiculous paternity claim. It's not a claim, Dad. It's the truth. Cheryl is my daughter, and you've known that since the day you paid Camille to disappear. David stood slowly, his imposing frame filling the space behind the desk. "I did what was necessary to protect this family and this company from a gold-digging opportunist who would have destroyed everything we've built." "She wasn't a gold digger." Steve's voice rose despite his efforts to stay calm. "She was the woman I loved, carrying my child, and you manipulated both of us to keep us apart." "Love," David spat. "You were 26 years old, thinking with your hormones instead of your brain. That woman would have been the end of your career, your reputation, your future. I saved you from making the biggest mistake of your life." "The biggest mistake of my life was letting you convince me she'd left on her own," Steve shot back. "I spent 9 years believing I wasn't worth fighting for, when the truth was you never gave her a chance to fight." David moved around the desk with predatory grace. "And look what you've accomplished in those 9 years. Miller Industries has tripled in value. You're respected in business circles worldwide. You have everything a man could want. Except the woman I love and the daughter I've missed watching grow up. A daughter you can't prove is yours without a paternity test, which any competent lawyer would demand before acknowledging any claims against the Miller estate." The casual cruelty of the statement hit Steve like a physical blow. "She's my daughter, Dad. Anyone with eyes can see she's a Miller." "Then you'll have no problem proving it legally," David said with a cold smile. "After which we can discuss appropriate support arrangements that don't involve disrupting your life or bringing scandal to this family." Steve stared at his father, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in his life. This man who'd shaped every major decision of Steve's existence, who'd convinced him that duty and reputation mattered more than love and happiness, who destroyed the most important relationship Steve had ever had out of nothing more than personal prejudice and control. "You bastard," Steve said quietly. "You arrogant, controlling bastard. You stole 9 years from me. 9 years of my daughter's life, 9 years with the woman I loved. And for what? So you could mold me into another version of yourself? I saved you from a life of mediocrity," David snapped. "That woman would have kept you small, content with middle-class dreams instead of the empire you were born to inherit." "Maybe I wanted to be small," Steve said, the truth of it hitting him as he spoke the words. "Maybe I wanted Sunday morning pancakes and school plays and helping with homework more than I wanted another quarterly profit report." David's laugh was bitter. "Don't be naive, Stephen. Men like us don't get to choose love over legacy. We have responsibilities." "No," Steve said, standing straighter as certainty filled him. "You have an obsession with control. I have a daughter I'm going to get to know and a woman I'm going to try to win back if she'll let me. If you pursue this fantasy, you'll lose everything," David warned. "I'll have you removed from the company, cut off from the family trust, disinherited completely. You'll have nothing to offer them but empty promises and romantic gestures." Steve felt something shift inside him, a weight lifting that he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. "You know what, Dad? I don't care. I'd rather have nothing with them than everything without them." The silence that followed was deafening. David Miller, the man who'd never encountered a problem he couldn't solve with money or influence, looked genuinely shocked that his own son was willing to walk away from everything he'd built. "You're making a mistake that will haunt you for the rest of your life," David said finally. "I already made that mistake," Steve replied. 9 years ago, when I believed your lies instead of fighting for what mattered. I won't make it again." Steve grabbed his briefcase and headed for the door, then paused without turning around. "By the way, Dad? I'm taking Cheryl to dinner tonight. She wants to show me her school, introduce me to her friends. Try to interfere with that, and you'll discover just how much I learned from watching you fight dirty all these years." Steve walked out of his father's presence and straight to Marge's desk, where his assistant was typing furiously while pretending she hadn't heard every word of the argument. "Marge, I need you to set up a meeting with the company lawyers. I want to know exactly what rights I have regarding my position and the family trust." "Already on it," she said without looking up. Also, there's a Dr. Juno Anderson online too. Says it's urgent regarding Camille Williams. Steve's blood went cold. He grabbed the phone immediately. Dr. Anderson? This is Steve Miller. Mr. Miller. Juno's voice was tight with worry. I need you to get to the gallery immediately. David Miller was here an hour ago, and Camille, she's in bad shape. Steve was already moving toward the elevator before she finished speaking. What happened? Is she hurt? Not physically. But whatever he said to her, it's bad. She sent Cheryl to me for the afternoon and locked herself in the gallery. She won't answer her phone, won't let me in. I'm worried about what she might do. The elevator couldn't move fast enough. Steve's mind raced with possibilities, each worse than the last. His father's cruelty knew no bounds when he felt his control slipping, and Camille had been his victim once before. 20 minutes later, Steve was pounding on the gallery door while Juno stood behind him wringing her hands. Camille, he called out. Open the door. Please, let me in. There was no response, but he could see light coming from the back office. She was in there, but she wasn't answering. The spare key, Juno said suddenly, digging through her purse. She gave me one for emergencies. They let themselves into the gallery, which felt eerily quiet after the warmth and life it had contained just days before. Steve found Camille in her office, sitting on the floor surrounded by scattered papers, her face streaked with tears. Camille. He knelt beside her, taking in the scene. Legal documents, bank statements, what looked like contracts or agreements. What did he do to you? She looked up at him with eyes that were red from crying, holding a thick folder of papers. He kept copies, she whispered. All these years, he kept copies of everything. Steve took the folder from her trembling hands, his rage building as he scanned the contents. Non-disclosure agreements. Financial support contracts. Documentation of payments made over 8 years to ensure Camille's silence about Cheryl's paternity. He's been paying you, Steve said, the pieces falling into place. All this time, he's been making support payments. Not support, Camille said bitterly. Hush money. Every month for 8 years, enough to keep Cheryl and me comfortable as long as I never contacted you, never told anyone who her father was. Steve kept reading, his horror growing with each document. He had you sign a contract saying you'd never seek additional support, never make any claims against the Miller family. He came here today with his lawyers, Camille continued, her voice hollow. Said that your recent inappropriate interest in me and my daughter was violating the spirit of our agreement. That if I didn't cease all contact with you immediately, he'd sue me for breach of contract and fraud. Fraud? For accepting support under false pretenses if I'm now claiming you're Cheryl's father after years of signed agreements stating otherwise. Camille's laugh was bitter and broken. He's made it so that loving you is literally a crime. Steve threw the papers aside and pulled Camille into his arms, feeling her shake with exhaustion and despair. He can't do this. These contracts were signed under duress, based on lies he told you about my feelings. No court would uphold them. You don't understand, Camille said against his chest. He doesn't need to win in court. He just needs to tie us up in legal battles for years while Cheryl watches her mother get destroyed by lawyers and private investigators. He made that very clear. Steve felt something murderous rise in his chest. His father hadn't just manipulated them, he'd created a legal trap that ensured even after the truth came out, Camille would still suffer for daring to love someone David Miller disapproved of. There's more, Camille whispered. He showed me photos. What kind of photos? Of you. At charity galas, business dinners, society events. Always with a different woman, always looking successful and happy. Her voice broke. He said you'd moved on years ago, that you'd built the exact life he'd always wanted for you, and my reappearance was just an inconvenient reminder of a youthful mistake. Steve pulled back to look at her face, seeing the fresh pain there. Camille, you can't believe that. I saw the pictures, Steve. You looked content. Successful. Like a man who'd found his place in the world. She wiped her eyes with shaking hands. Maybe he was right all along. Maybe loving me really would have destroyed everything good in your life. Look at me, Steve said firmly, taking her face in his hands. Listen to what I'm about to tell you, and believe it with everything you have. Every single one of those events was torture. Every woman I dated was a desperate attempt to feel something, anything, that came close to what I felt with you. And every single night for 9 years, I went to bed wondering what I'd done wrong to make you leave. Camille searched his eyes, wanting desperately to believe him. I was never content, Steve continued. I was surviving. Building walls around my heart so high that nothing could get in, because letting anyone close just reminded me of what I'd lost. The only time I felt truly alive in 9 years was the moment I saw you walk into that restaurant. He'll destroy us, Camille whispered. He has unlimited resources, unlimited power. He'll make sure we never have a moment's peace. Then we'll fight him together, Steve said with fierce determination. I've spent 9 years living the life he wanted for me, and I've been miserable every single day. I won't spend another minute prioritizing his approval over your happiness. And Cheryl? Cheryl deserves to know her father, and I deserve to know my daughter. Whatever legal battles we have to fight, whatever scandals we have to weather, it will be worth it to be a family. Camille was quiet for a long moment, and Steve could see her weighing their chances against David Miller's power and influence. He said something else, she said finally. Something that made me realize how deep his manipulation really goes. What? He told me about the emergency board meeting the night I left. The one that took you away from our apartment. Camille's eyes filled with fresh tears. There was no emergency, Steve. He called that meeting specifically to get you out of the apartment so he could come see me alone. Steve felt the last piece of the puzzle click into place, and the magnitude of his father's orchestration hit him like a tsunami. He planned everything. Every detail, every manipulation, every lie. He knew exactly what to say to make you believe leaving was the only choice. He's been controlling our lives for 9 years, Steve. Even when we thought we were free, we were still dancing to his tune. Camille looked around her gallery with something like despair. How do we fight someone like that? How do we build something real when he's willing to destroy everything to maintain control? Steve stood up, pulling Camille with him. He moved to the small alcove where her painting hung. The painting of the man at the window, reaching for something beyond his grasp. You painted this when you thought I'd chosen his approval over our love, he said, studying the piece that had haunted him since he'd first seen it. But what if the man in the painting isn't reaching for something he can't have? What if he's reaching for something he's finally brave enough to fight for? Camille moved to stand beside him, seeing her own work through new eyes. What are you saying? I'm saying it's time to stop letting fear make our choices for us. Steve turned to face her, his green eyes blazing with determination. I'm going to walk away from Miller Industries, from the family trust, from everything he's ever held over my head. And then I'm going to prove that the only inheritance I care about is the family I build with you and Cheryl. Steve, you can't just throw away your entire life. I'm not throwing it away, he interrupted. I'm finally choosing it. For the first time in 35 years, I'm going to make a decision based on what I want instead of what David Miller thinks I should want. Camille stared at him, seeing the man she'd fallen in love with all those years ago finally emerging from behind the walls of duty and expectation. This was the Steve who'd dreamed of changing the world together, who'd talked about building something meaningful instead of just profitable. He'll make us pay for this, she said quietly. Let him try, Steve replied. I've learned a few things about fighting dirty over the years. And unlike him, I have something worth fighting for. The gallery fell silent around them as they stood before the painting that had represented 9 years of separation and loss. But now, bathed in the warm afternoon light, it looked different. Less like a man reaching for the impossible, and more like someone finally ready to break down the barriers between himself and the life he truly wanted. "What do we do first?" Camille asked, and Steve heard the tentative hope in her voice. "First, we go get our daughter from Juno's and have that family dinner I promised Cheryl. Then we start building the life we should have had 9 years ago." He took her hand, marveling at how perfectly it fit in his. "And then we show David Miller what happens when he underestimates the power of people who refuse to be controlled." Camille looked at their joined hands, then up at Steve's face, seeing the future she'd dreamed of but never dared to hope for. "Are you sure? Once we do this, there's no going back." "I've been going backward for 9 years, Steve said, bringing her hand to his lips. "It's time to move forward." As they left the gallery together, walking toward a future that would demand everything they had to give, neither of them noticed the black sedan parked across the street, or the photographer with the telephoto lens capturing every moment of their reunion. David Miller's war was just beginning. Chapter 4. The battle lines were drawn, but Steve Miller had never felt more at peace. 3 weeks had passed since he'd walked out of his father's office, and each day brought him closer to the life he'd always been meant to live. He'd moved into a modest apartment 6 blocks from Camille's house, close enough to be part of Cheryl's daily routine but far enough to give Camille space to process the enormous changes in their lives. This morning, he was making pancakes in Camille's kitchen while she got ready for work and Cheryl finished her spelling homework at the breakfast table. It was such an ordinary moment, the kind he'd dreamed about for 9 years, and yet it felt miraculous in its simplicity. "Daddy, you're burning them," Cheryl observed with the matter-of-fact honesty of an 8-year-old. Steve looked down at the pan, where his distraction had indeed resulted in slightly crispy edges. "Good catch, sweetheart. I'm still learning." "Mama makes them better," Cheryl said with a grin, "but yours taste like love, so they're still good." The comment hit Steve directly in the heart. "They taste like love?" Dr. Juno says when people cook for you because they want to make you happy, you can taste the love in the food. Your pancakes are very loving." Steve had to clear his throat before he could respond. "Well, that's the most important ingredient, isn't it?" Camille appeared in the doorway, dressed for the gallery in a flowing burgundy dress that made Steve's breath catch. Even after weeks of tentative courtship, of careful rebuilding of trust and intimacy, she still had the power to make his heart race with a single glance. "Something smells wonderful," she said, moving to pour herself coffee. When she passed behind Steve's chair, her hand brushed his shoulder in a gesture that was becoming natural again. Small touches that rebuilt their connection one moment at a time. "Daddy's pancakes taste like love," Cheryl announced proudly. "I told him yours are better, but his are good too." Camille's eyes met Steve's over their daughter's head, and the look they shared was full of wonder at this life they were building together. "I think the best pancakes are the ones we make together," she said diplomatically. "Can we do that?" Cheryl asked with sudden enthusiasm. "Can we make pancakes together like a real family?" The innocent question created a moment of weighted silence. They were a real family, but the legal and emotional complications created by David Miller's interference made everything feel fragile, temporary. "We are a real family, baby," Camille said gently. "Sometimes families look different than what you see on TV, but that doesn't make them less real. But wouldn't it be better if we all lived together? If Daddy didn't have to go home to his sad apartment every night?" Steve nearly choked on his coffee. "My apartment isn't sad." "It is too," Cheryl said with certainty. "It doesn't have any pictures or books or stuff that makes a place feel like home. It's just furniture and sadness." "Cheryl Marie Williams," Camille said with barely suppressed laughter, "you cannot diagnose people's apartments with emotions." "I can too. Dr. Juno taught me about reading emotional environments for my art. Daddy's apartment is definitely sad. Steve looked between his daughter and the woman he loved, seeing the future he wanted more clearly than ever. What if we fixed that? What if we made some changes so nobody had to live in a sad apartment anymore? Camille's eyes widened slightly. They'd been taking things slow, rebuilding trust and navigating the complex emotions of their reunion. They hadn't talked about living arrangements or making their tentative relationship permanent. "Steve," she said carefully, "we should probably talk about this when," she was interrupted by the sharp ring of the doorbell. All three of them froze, recognizing the authoritative sound that somehow conveyed David Miller's presence before they even saw him. "I'll get it," Steve said grimly, already knowing who he'd find on the other side of the door. David Miller stood on Camille's front porch in an expensive wool coat, flanked by two men in suits who could only be lawyers. His expression was coldly furious, and he held a thick folder of documents. "Stephen," he said without preamble. "We need to discuss your recent decisions and their consequences." "Not here," Steve said immediately. "Not in front of Cheryl." "Oh, I think the child should hear this," David said with cruel satisfaction. "Since it concerns her future directly." Steve stepped outside and closed the door behind him, positioning himself between his father and his family. "Say whatever you came to say and then leave." David smiled, and it wasn't pleasant. "I've had 3 weeks to prepare for your rebellion, son. Did you really think you could walk away from your responsibilities without consequences?" He opened the folder and pulled out a series of photographs, high-resolution images of Steve and Camille together, Steve playing with Cheryl at the park, intimate moments stolen over the past weeks. "Lovely family pictures," David said mockingly. "They'll look very compelling in court when I file for custody of my granddaughter." Steve's blood turned to ice. "What? You've proven yourself unfit to make decisions regarding the child's welfare. Walking away from a multi-million-dollar company to play house with a woman who's been defrauding the Miller family for 8 years? Any family court judge will see you're not thinking clearly. You can't file for custody. You have no legal standing." "Oh, but I do," David interrupted, pulling out more documents. "DNA tests confirming paternity, which I had done through samples collected from items you discarded. Financial records showing your recent erratic behavior and abandonment of fiscal responsibility. Character witnesses who will testify that you've become unstable and obsessed." Steve scanned the papers with growing horror. His father had been thorough, building a legal case designed to destroy everything Steve cared about. "The child needs stability," David continued. "A proper family environment with adequate financial resources and moral guidance. I'm prepared to offer full custody to a more suitable family member who can provide those things." "What family member?" Steve asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Your cousin Robert and his wife have been trying to adopt for years. They're pillars of the community, financially stable, morally upright. Perfect parents for a child who's been raised in questionable circumstances." The casual cruelty of it took Steve's breath away. His father was planning to take Cheryl away from both her parents and give her to distant relatives as punishment for Steve's defiance. "You're insane," Steve said quietly. "You would destroy a child's life to maintain control over mine?" "I would save a child from the chaos you're creating," David replied coldly. "Camille Williams has proven herself to be manipulative and mercenary. You've proven yourself to be weak and easily led astray. Neither of you is capable of providing the stability that child needs." The front door opened behind Steve, and Camille stepped out with Cheryl clinging to her side. They'd obviously heard enough of the conversation to understand the threat. "You can't take my daughter," Camille said, her voice shaking with fury and fear. "I don't care how much money you have or how many lawyers you've hired. She's my child." David's gaze fixed on Cheryl with calculating coldness. "Hello, young lady. I'm your grandfather," David Miller. We haven't been properly introduced. Cheryl pressed closer to Camille, instinctively afraid of this man despite his polite words. I don't want to meet you, she said with the brutal honesty of childhood. You're the reason my daddy had to live in a sad apartment for so long. David's smile faltered slightly. He'd clearly expected to charm or intimidate the child, not be rejected outright. Cheryl, he said with forced warmth, you don't understand the situation. Your father and mother have made some poor choices that affect your future. But don't worry, I'm going to make sure you're taken care of properly. I don't want to be taken care of by you, Cheryl said with growing confidence. I want to stay with Mama and Daddy. We're a family. An unstable family, David said, his mask slipping. Your mother has been lying to your father for years, and your father has abandoned his responsibilities to play pretend with you. That's not the kind of environment a child should grow up in. That's enough, Steve said, stepping forward. But Cheryl surprised everyone by moving past both her parents to stand directly in front of her grandfather. You're mean, she said with the devastating clarity that only children possess. And you're wrong about my mama and daddy. They love each other and they love me, and love is more important than money or being proper or whatever stupid grown-up things you think matter. David Miller, who had intimidated business rivals and world leaders, found himself speechless in the face of an 8-year-old's righteous indignation. And another thing, Cheryl continued, getting more confident as she spoke, if you try to take me away from my family, I'll scream and cry and make such a fuss that everyone will know you're a bad person who steals children from their mamas and daddies. The adult stood frozen as this tiny girl faced down one of the most powerful men in the city with nothing but fierce love and stubborn determination. Cheryl, Camille said gently, come here, sweetheart. But Cheryl wasn't finished. My daddy chose us, she said to David with absolute certainty. He could have stayed with his sad apartment and his lonely job, but he chose to be with people who love him. That doesn't make him weak. That makes him brave. Steve felt something break open in his chest. This beautiful, fierce little girl was defending him with the same courage Camille had shown when she'd left to protect their unborn child. The courage that ran in their bloodline, that had nothing to do with money or power and everything to do with love. You heard her, Steve said to his father, stepping forward to put his hand on Cheryl's shoulder. We're a family. A real family that chooses love over fear, connection over control. And if you want to take that away from us, you'll have to go through all three of us. David looked between them. Steve standing protectively behind his daughter, Camille's arms wrapped around both of them, Cheryl's chin raised in defiant challenge, and for the first time in the confrontation, he looked uncertain. This isn't over, he said finally, gathering his documents. I'll see you in court, Stephen. All of you. As his father walked away with his lawyers in tow, Steve felt Cheryl slip her small hand into his. Are we really going to have to go to court? She asked with a child's practical concern about adult complications. Maybe, Steve said honestly. But whatever happens, we'll face it together. As a family. Good, Cheryl said with satisfaction. Because I have more things to say to mean old men who think money is more important than love. Camille laughed despite everything, pulling both Steve and Cheryl into a fierce hug. I think we all do, baby. I think we all do. That evening, after Cheryl had gone to bed, Steve and Camille sat on her living room couch surrounded by legal documents and strategy notes. The threat of David Miller's custody suit hung over them, but somehow, facing it together made it seem less insurmountable. He's serious, Camille said, reviewing the preliminary filing documents that had arrived by courier. He's actually going to court to try to take her away from us. Then we'll fight him, Steve said simply. I've already called the best family law attorney in the state. She thinks we have a strong case, especially with Cheryl's age and stated preferences. What if we lose? The question was barely a whisper, but it carried 9 years of fear and pain. Steve turned to face her fully, taking her hands in his. We won't lose. Because what we have is real, and what he's offering is control disguised as care. Any judge who spends 5 minutes with Cheryl will see the difference. He has unlimited resources, Steve. He can drag this out for years, make our lives miserable. Let him try, Steve interrupted. I've been miserable for 9 years living the life he wanted for me. I'd rather be broke and fighting for what matters than rich and empty. Camille searched his face, seeing the truth there. This was the man she'd fallen in love with all those years ago, not the CEO or the heir, but the person who believed in fighting for what was right even when it was difficult. There's something else, she said quietly. Something I haven't told you. Steve's heart clenched, but he kept his voice steady. What is it? I've been keeping journals. Since the day I left, I've been writing down everything, your father's threats, the payments, the legal agreements, everything. I have 9 years of documentation of his manipulation and control. Steve stared at her. Why didn't you tell me this before? Because I was afraid, she admitted. Afraid that using them would make me just like him, manipulative, calculating. But watching him threaten to take Cheryl away from us. I can't worry about being the bigger person anymore. Steve pulled her into his arms, marveling at this woman who'd been protecting their family in ways he was only beginning to understand. You're nothing like him, Camille. He uses information to control people. You documented the truth to protect your daughter. Our daughter, she corrected softly. Our daughter, he agreed, and the words felt like a promise. They spent the next hour going through Camille's journals, building a timeline of David Miller's systematic manipulation. By the time they finished, they had a compelling case for emotional manipulation and extortion that would make any custody claim look like what it was, an act of revenge, not concern for a child's welfare. We're going to win this, Steve said with growing confidence. Not just the custody case, but everything. We're going to build the life we should have had 9 years ago. Camille looked around her living room, at the family photos that now included Steve, at Cheryl's artwork covering the refrigerator, at the evidence of a life built on love rather than obligation. What kind of life do you want? She asked quietly. Steve was silent for a moment, considering the question that had haunted him for years. I want Sunday morning pancakes and bedtime stories. I want to teach Cheryl to drive and walk her down the aisle someday. I want to grow old with you and argue about whose turn it is to do the dishes. He paused, meeting her eyes directly. I want the ordinary, extraordinary life we never got to have. And your father? The company? The inheritance? Let him keep it all, Steve said without hesitation. I'd rather build something new with you than inherit something old from him. Camille smiled, and it was radiant with possibilities. What would you build? A consulting firm, maybe. Help other family businesses navigate succession without destroying relationships in the process. Use everything I learned from watching him do it wrong to help other families do it right. That's perfect, she said softly. You'd be helping families stay together instead of tearing them apart. What about you? What do you want? Camille looked toward the stairs where their daughter slept peacefully, then back at the man she'd loved through 9 years of separation. I want to marry you, she said simply. I want Cheryl to have your name legally, not just in her heart. I want to wake up every morning knowing that whatever challenges we face, we're facing them together. Steve felt his breath catch. Are you proposing to me? Maybe I am, she said with a smile that reminded him of the fearless young woman who'd stolen his heart. Someone has to, and you're taking too long to ask. Steve laughed, pulling her closer. Camille Williams, will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life making up for the 9 years we lost? Yes, she whispered against his lips. Yes to all of it. Their kiss was soft and full of promise, the kind of kiss that sealed futures rather than just moments. When they broke apart, Steve rested his forehead against hers. "We should probably wait until after the custody case is resolved," he said practically. "Don't give him any more ammunition about our stability." "Probably," Camille agreed. "But I don't want to wait to start living like a family." "What do you mean?" "I mean your daughter is right. Your apartment is sad, and it's silly for you to keep living there when your home is here with us." Steve pulled back to look at her face, hardly daring to hope. "Are you asking me to move in?" "I'm asking you to come home," she said simply. "To the family that's been waiting for you for 9 years. 2 months later, Steve Miller stood in a courthouse wearing his best suit and holding his daughter's hand while they waited for Judge Patricia Morrison to deliver her verdict on David Miller's custody petition. The case had been brutal. Weeks of depositions, character witnesses, and invasive questions about their family dynamics. But it had also been clarifying. David Miller's true nature had been revealed under the harsh light of legal scrutiny, his manipulation and control exposed for what they really were. Camille's journals had provided damning evidence of systematic emotional abuse, and Cheryl's own testimony, given privately to the judge, had been devastatingly clear about where she wanted to live. "Has the court reached a decision?" Judge Morrison asked formally. "Yes, Your Honor," the court clerk replied. Judge Morrison looked directly at David Miller before speaking. "Mr. Miller, while I don't doubt your financial ability to provide for this child, I find your motivations for seeking custody to be questionable at best and vindictive at worst. The evidence presented suggests a pattern of manipulation and control that would not serve this child's best interests." David's face remained impassive, but Steve could see the rage simmering beneath the surface. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "I find the current living arrangement with both biological parents to be stable, loving, and in the child's best interests. The petition for custody transfer is denied." Steve felt Cheryl's hand squeeze his as relief flooded through him. They'd won. Not just the case, but the right to be a family without interference. However, Judge Morrison added, "I am granting Mr. David Miller supervised visitation rights as the child's grandfather, should he choose to exercise them in a manner that respects the family unit and serves the child's emotional well-being." It was more than Steve would have preferred, but less than David had demanded. A compromise that preserved family connections while protecting them from further manipulation. As they left the courthouse, Cheryl skipped between her parents with obvious joy. "Can we get ice cream to celebrate?" she asked. "And can we finally start planning your wedding now that all the scary legal stuff is over?" Steve and Camille exchanged glances over their daughter's head, both thinking the same thing, that this 8-year-old had been far too involved in adult complications, but had handled them with more grace than most grown-ups could have managed. "Ice cream sounds perfect," Camille said. "And yes, we can start planning our wedding." "Can I help pick out your dress?" Cheryl asked eagerly. "And can I be the flower girl? And can we have the wedding at the gallery so all your paintings can watch?" "All of that sounds wonderful," Steve said, marveling at how quickly his daughter's mind had moved from legal battles to wedding planning. "What else should we include in this wedding?" "Pancakes," Cheryl said immediately. "We should serve pancakes at the reception because they taste like love, and that's what weddings are really about." Steve stopped walking and knelt down to his daughter's level, overwhelmed by the simple wisdom of her observation. "You're absolutely right," he said seriously. "Love is exactly what weddings are about. Love and family and choosing to be together even when it's hard." "And pancakes," Cheryl added with a grin. "And pancakes," Steve agreed, pulling both his girls into a hug right there on the courthouse steps. 6 months later, Expressions Gallery was transformed into a wedding venue filled with warm lights, Camille's favorite artwork, and the scent of fresh flowers. The guest list was small but meaningful. Friends who'd supported them through the legal battles, colleagues who'd become family, and children from Cheryl's class who'd been invited specifically to enjoy the pancake bar that had become the reception's main attraction. Steve stood at the makeshift altar surrounded by paintings that told the story of Camille's journey, her pain, her growth, her hope for the future. When she appeared at the back of the gallery in a simple ivory dress with Cheryl beside her in purple silk, he felt his heart stop with the same intensity as that first night at the restaurant. Camille had chosen to walk herself down the aisle, with Cheryl as her escort. It was symbolic, Steve knew, this strong, independent woman who'd built a life on her own terms, now choosing to share it with him not out of need, but out of love. When they reached him, Cheryl took her position as maid of honor with solemn importance, holding both their rings and beaming with pride. "Dearly beloved," the officiant began, but Steve barely heard the traditional words. He was too busy looking at Camille's face, seeing his own joy reflected there, marveling at the journey that had brought them back to each other. "Do you, Stephen Miller, take Camille Williams to be your wife, to love and cherish, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Steve said, his voice clear and strong. "I choose you, Camille. I choose us. I choose this family we've built together, and I promise to never let fear or other people's expectations come between us again." "And do you, Camille Williams, take Stephen Miller to be your husband, to love and cherish, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Camille said, tears streaming down her face. "I choose love over fear, truth over convenience, and this beautiful, complicated, wonderful life we're building together." "The rings, please," the officiant said, turning to Cheryl. Their daughter stepped forward with ceremonial seriousness, offering the simple bands they'd chosen together. As Steve slipped Camille's ring onto her finger, he thought about the first ring she'd left on his nightstand 9 years ago, the symbol of a love that had been interrupted but never truly ended. "By the power vested in me by the state, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Steve cupped Camille's face in his hands, seeing his whole future in her eyes. Their kiss was soft and sweet, full of promises and second chances, witnessed by everyone who'd helped them fight for this moment. "And now," Cheryl announced loudly as they broke apart, "let's eat pancakes." The reception was exactly what their unconventional family needed, joyful chaos with children running between art installations, adults laughing over plates of breakfast food served at dinner time, and a 3-tiered cake shaped like a stack of pancakes that made everyone smile. Steve found a quiet moment with his new wife near the painting that had started it all, What Could Have Been. Only now, the title seemed wrong. This wasn't what could have been. This was what was meant to be, despite every obstacle that had been placed in their path. "Any regrets?" Camille asked, following his gaze to the painting. "Only one," Steve said, pulling her close. "That it took us 9 years to get here." "Maybe we needed those 9 years," she said thoughtfully. "Maybe we both had to become the people we are now to appreciate what we have." Steve considered this, thinking about the scared young man he'd been, desperate for his father's approval. And the woman beside him, who'd found her strength in the crucible of single motherhood and emerged fierce and independent. "Maybe you're right," he said. "Maybe everything happened exactly when it was supposed to." "Mama. Daddy." Cheryl's voice called out across the gallery. "Come dance with me." They found their daughter in the center of the cleared floor, spinning in her purple dress with complete abandon. Other children had joined her, and soon the formal wedding reception had devolved into the kind of joyful celebration that children excel at creating. Steve swept Cheryl into his arms while Camille took her other hand, and they danced together, this family that had been torn apart by fear and brought back together by love. Around them, their friends and chosen family celebrated not just a wedding, but a victory of hope over cynicism, of connection over control. David Miller had not attended the wedding, though he'd been invited. Steve had extended the olive branch not because he expected reconciliation, but because Cheryl deserved the chance to know her grandfather if he could learn to put her needs before his own agenda. The absence said everything about what mattered most to the man who'd once controlled every aspect of Steve's life. But his absence didn't diminish the joy of the celebration. If anything, it highlighted how much happier Steve was surrounding himself with people who loved him for who he was, rather than trying to please someone who loved him for who he could become under their control. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, the new Miller family found themselves alone in the gallery, surrounded by the detritus of celebration, empty plates, scattered flower petals, and the warm glow of string lights that had transformed Camille's professional space into something magical. "Best wedding ever," Cheryl declared, sprawled dramatically on the gallery floor in her rumpled dress. "Even with the pancakes?" Steve teased. "Especially with the pancakes," she said firmly. "Regular wedding food is boring. Our food tasted like happiness." Steve and Camille sat down on either side of their daughter, the three of them forming a small circle on the gallery floor. "What happens now?" Cheryl asked with the mixture of excitement and apprehension that children feel when big changes loom. "Now we go home," Camille said simply. "All of us, together. And tomorrow we start our new life as a officially married family." "Will things be different?" Cheryl wondered. Steve considered the question seriously. "Some things will be different. I'll be here every morning to make pancakes and every night to read bedtime stories. Your mama and I will make decisions together instead of separately. And you'll never have to worry about anyone trying to take you away from us again. But the important things will stay the same," Camille added. "We'll still love each other just as much. We'll still be the same people who choose each other every day." Cheryl nodded with satisfaction. "Good. I like us the way we are." "So do I," Steve said, looking around the gallery that had become the setting for so many of their important moments, the revelation of Cheryl's existence, the confrontation with his father, and now their wedding. "I like us exactly the way we are." As they cleaned up the remnants of their celebration, Steve reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 9 years of separation, months of legal battles, a lifetime of learning to choose love over fear. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every moment of struggle to arrive at this simple truth, that home wasn't a place or a position or an inheritance. Home was wherever the people you loved were brave enough to love you back. Love sometimes requires us to be braver than we ever thought possible. When has love asked you to choose courage over comfort? Share your story with our Dear Love Diaries family below. And if this story of second chances and family healing touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of love conquering all the obstacles life puts in our path.